Today is Friday, March 13th, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson, and I'm here with my podcast co-host, Mr. Wallace G. Smith. Mr. Smith, how are we doing this morning?
I think we're doing all right. I feel like I've gotten 1/4 of my task accomplished this week, and it's just Friday. I've got a little more time. Maybe I'll pull off more. You know, with this change of daylight savings time, sunset is a little bit later.
Yeah.
So anyway, good week.
Once again, I'm going to take my twice-a-year opportunity to say how much I don't like the time change. So, Mr. Smith, a lot going on in the world right now. You and I have always tried to be careful about not weighing in too soon on a large world matter, because sometimes the earlier reporting gets corrected later and you get a better view of things.
Yeah, there's always a lot going on.
Yeah.
Right?
How should we think biblically about the war in Iran?
That, Mr. Robinson, is the right question. There's a lot going on in Iran. The United States and Israel actually direct allies working together in a single war effort. It's a remarkable time looking at what's going on. We have held off. All these different talking heads are pontificating, predictions, etc. But what is this podcast about? It's how to think biblically. So that is today's topic. How do we think biblically about the war in Iran? Thanks for sticking through the music, and welcome again to the Living Youth Podcast. And just like Mr. Robinson said, y'all probably noticed it. You might just think we're slackers. Something happens in the world and we don't talk immediately about that. We've kind of addressed that in another podcast, that this whole 24/7 news cycle, it's like you can't have anything happen and let facts come out, let things mature, see where directions are going without not only the news, but all the different talking heads and all the prognosticators. Honestly, it's easy to just get, frankly, it's really designed to keep you coming. It's designed to, it's kind of news junkie stuff.
Right. And it's a constant feed of overall negativity. And if you're just plugged into that 24/7, even if you're the most optimistic person, in time, that's going to start making you feel real, not good about the direction, which is true, you know?
Right. Yeah. Upset people tend to be people who come back. So Mr. Robinson actually has made we were talking even earlier about that the danger of just constantly getting caught in the news cycle where you're virtually overfed information, just a constant feed. And what you are fed tends to be what the algorithm has determined you want to be fed. Even if you don't know you want to be fed that, it knows because of your engagement activity. Actually, Mr. Robinson, you were making a good point about it's almost like two different wars going on depending on who you're watching, right? What was that?
Well, so I really did pull back probably maybe somewhere between 15 and 20 years ago, because I really enjoyed that you had news at your fingertip. You could really...
Yeah, it's right there, all these sources.
But before the internet really took hold, though, the news cycle was manageable. In general, you had once a day, the newspapers summarized the news up to that point, but then as TV grabbed hold, but that was still the same kind of cycle.
The evening news,
exactly. But then when CNN came around, then you had a 24-hour news network, but then the internet just took it to a whole nother level. And so after a while, I decided that, one, it was unnecessary for me to know everything that was going on in the world every 15 minutes. I don't know if they have it anymore. They used to have CNN headline news that was like a news.
Oh, I forgot about that.
Yeah,
That's
every
right.
30 minutes it could be a new cycle. And also, it did make me kind of a bit anxious about the world conditions, because primarily what you heard was bad news and bad things that were happening. And then I pulled back and I realized it's not necessary for me to know literally everything going on every single day. Even if you only knew what the news was once a week, you would could probably keep up with things pretty well. But the other thing that I found was, as I re-engaged in this Iran war, I actually went back to reading and watching quite a bit of coverage of the war. And it didn't take long for one thing to really stand out to me, is that the war is being covered in two very different ways.
Right. It's like watching two different wars in a sense.
It really is. You have one segment that is pretty down on the war, and this isn't going to work. And I've seen, Trump's great mistake, and maybe that will ultimately prove to be the case,
quote
but,
unquote, right?
But very, very negative coverage of it, and what a bad idea this is. And then there is a whole other group that talks about how amazing the United States military is, and in like 5 days we had Iran practically in the Stone Age, and this is the military might, and they haven't really managed to inflict much damage, and then Mr. Trump's already saying this war is practically over,
right,
and I think it's fairly well established that we know that the algorithm is going to feed us kind of our preference. So if you're kind of, let's say, I think this is very reasonable, you're not a big Trump fan, you I don't even want to say which political direction you would go.
But you've watched other news on YouTube or something that fits that, right.
And then I noticed even within the more, let's say conservative side, that was more not necessarily pro-war, but that America was doing very well. They can do whatever they want. They're going to open up the Strait of Hormuz, all of this kind of thing. Even that kind of was divided into two different ways of covering it. And so what was my conclusion? Once again, we can't be too dogmatic about what's going on, because how's it going? Well, if I don't like the war, it's not going very well. If I do like the war, it's
going great.
Well.
Yeah. I've noticed the same thing with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It really depends on who I want to watch. And if I watch these folks, it's like, oh, Russia, boy, they've got so many people to throw. There's no way Ukraine has a chance. But I watch other people. It's like, man, Ukraine, the scrappy underdog, they're just taking it to Russia. And it's like, man, they really could win this if only they had a little more help.
Right.
It really depends on who you want to watch and how they've decided they want things to turn out. When it comes to the war in Iran, there are those that would love to see Mr. Trump and the United States and Israel fail. It'd be a great comeuppance. And there's others who would think, no, it'd be wonderful to see America on top again, really shaping the world and, in a quote unquote, at least positive direction. And yeah, the algorithms know. At least when you had just nightly news, everyone leaned a little bit to the left, at least a little bit. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the closest thing to an algorithm was you picking your channel, and that was kind of about it. Versus now, it's fine-tuned, and the spectrum, there's a different take on the news for just about everything. You can't trust that. And that doesn't just include, say, if you will, quote-unquote, secular news, but even the kind of biblical take. People think kind of seeing prophecy unfold in different ways. Well, that's what we want to talk to you about, is how to think biblically about these things. And you've kind of already heard a bit of a hint, which is try turning off the news some. If you're young and you're out there thinking that unless you're constantly taking in the news 24/7 or 24/6 as the case may be, but as long as if you're then somehow you're failing, no, actually you might actually be a bit wiser than some others, that you do need to take a break and kind of step back and try to find a trusted source or neutral source. I'm not advertising for them, but I'm trying out Ground News. Not only do they report, or they're more of an aggregator, but they also have sort of ranked all these different news sources, whether they lean left or lean right, and they'll do even opposing stories. They'll say, here's how this is covered by the things that lean left, and here's how it's covered by things that lean right. And it's actually kind of fascinating to see in that regard. But again, it's sort of a news aggregator. But really, the news is the news. And the newscasters, even the smartest of them, there's things they do not know. And that is how God is planning for history to unfold.
100%. So for example, if somebody came up to me and asked me, well, what do you think are the prophetic implications of this war in Iran? I would have two answers to it. First, I would just be honest and say, I have no idea, because that's kind of true. I mean, I could speculate a lot. Uh-huh. I could come up with several plausible scenarios,
right?
But at the end of the day, don't know. And when it is fulfilled, we'll know it. But the other thing is, I will say this though, this is a pretty significant turn of history. However, it's going to turn out.
Oh yeah,
because going out at the very least, right now where we are, I would say it would take Iran 5 to 10 years to recover back to a normal nation again, and that's assuming we don't, we put no-fly zones over countries before. So
Right.
So the regime, will it change? Don't know. To some degree, of course it will, because so many leaders have been killed.
Yeah, something's going to change.
Yeah. So something in Iran is going to shift, but we don't know also the other dominoes that will fall, the ripples for the other nations in the Gulf, and frankly, China has some links to all this. I don't think we're going to go into that, but we can only guess at what this is going to mean long term from a prophetic standpoint.
Yeah, and that really is part of the theme. I got this analogy from the book I read on AI, the one titled "If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies." That book.
Yes.
And I'll probably get his name wrong. I don't know if he's still the top champion. What's his name? What's the top?
Is it Magnuson?
Is it that is Magnus Carlsen?
Huh.
Maybe.
Let's find out.
Okay, Mr. Robinson, do
this is an area in which apparently we're illiterate.
This kind of indication how we really are kind of riffing off the cuff on a lot of these things. I think it's Magnus Carlsen. I could be wrong. And I don't know if he's still the top guy, but let's just say this.
It's Magnus Carlsen.
It is Magnus Carlsen. Yeah. And let's say this, whether he's still the top guy or not, he plays better than me or Mr. Robinson.
Yes.
Or my son Benjamin and Mr. Mike DeSimone, they like to play because they're...
If somebody came to me and said I could beat you in 5 moves, they would probably be
I'd say, yeah, you're probably right. If, either that or you're a great bluffer. However, let me say this, Magnus Carlsen is someone who can do that. And the book made this good point. It was talking about AI, but it's true more broadly, and I would say true with prophecy and how God is moving things on the board. When you sit down with Magnus Carlsen, almost anyone who's listening to this, if you think you're different, good for you. But when you sit down, the way that game is going to unfold, that could be a million different possibilities, right? Yep. But the final outcome is a given. You're going to lose. You're going to lose to him. Now, what exactly are you going to do? What exactly is he going to do between here and there? Those things can vary. And that doesn't mean you don't notice significant moments on the board, right? That you're watching, and then next thing you know, he starts to put his queen into play. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, I don't know exactly what he's going to do with this, but that is significant. Well, I feel like that's kind of where we are here. God is clearly bringing significant players into the field, if you will, but exactly what's he going to do with them? People get so caught up in thinking that biblical thinking about an event means, I got to know, God should tell us exactly what's going to happen here or exactly what's going to happen there. And we're going to find that, no, he actually does not do that. What does it mean to think biblically about things like this? I think for the sake of this podcast, we can highlight 3 key things. One, thinking biblically, well, before this, it's not trying to predict the outcome on this micro scale, but it does involve, one, keeping an eye on the overall arc of prophecy. Like, for instance, knowing that Magnus Carlsen is going to win the game and watching the game from that perspective, looking at the moves, knowing that and expecting that. Number 2, recognizing the biblical factors that come into play that are often ignored by others. There's things that the Bible reveals that newscasters do not keep in mind and yet are relevant factors. And then number 3, ultimately fixing our hopes not on a particular outcome, but on the coming of God's kingdom. I am an American. We have listeners all over the world, and we love you and appreciate you. But personally, Mr. Robinson and I are Americans, and man, you hate to see America lose, right? In something, and you hate to see our esteem fall, and you love to see people like the persecuted people of Iran, liberated and enjoying some freedom. But on the other hand, we must, what do we really care about? The return of God's kingdom, which is the only solution to all of these things. So with those things in mind, what we thought we'd do for the rest of the podcast is take a look at some of the details that are related to the overall arc of prophecy and different biblical factors that people tend to ignore because they don't have God's word open to them. So what is my first point, Mr. Robinson? I got to scroll
right there.
To it.
Point 1, each of the parties has a destiny that will be fulfilled as God is moving his pieces on the board, that is this world.
Hey, I didn't even know we were going to talk about Magnus Carlsen, but on that point I was thinking like a chessboard. So yeah, that's what he's doing. He is working out his end game.
That's such a good way of putting it, by the way. It's a thing that gets lost a little bit when we read about the history of Israel, but some of the ways in which God moved pieces on the chessboard are very unique and unexpected.
Yeah, they really are. And that's actually, it's kind of funny you say that. that's when some of the human chess masters started to realize that AI was better than them now. Is the AI would make moves none of them could figure out. You know, when you're playing a human opponent, you could realize, oh, he might be doing this. He's doing the Chesterton defense. I just made that up. I think it sounds real.
It sounds real.
He's doing this, or I think that, and so you can try. But then the AI, once they were really like beating Kasparov and such, Deep Blue, I think it is, they were making moves that they could not fathom. There was like the alien thinking, like, why would anybody make that move? And they couldn't figure it out. And they started to realize, because it is playing at such a level, I can't access it, right? I can't figure that out, because it was demolishing people. And that's what God does. In this sense, it's Magnus Carlsen who's the one that falls short. God is more like the AI chess player who's doing moves that it's easy for you to think you've got him figured out, and the next thing you know, he absolutely is doing something else. But he is still working towards this destiny and this purpose that he had, the end game that he has planned. And each of the parties involved, that's the U.S., that's Israel, it's Iran, it's the other Arabic partners in all of this. Frankly, it's China, it's Europe, it's Germany within Europe. God has a destiny for those that he is working with in terms of what he's trying to accomplish in the world. And that's what matters more than all the numbers, more than all the sizes of armies. Now, the verse that comes to mind is kind of a go-to in that regard, and that's in Isaiah chapter 46. In Isaiah 46, I like to start in verse 8, because I like the sound of the way God is talking here. But in Isaiah 46, starting in verse 8, he says, "Remember this and show yourselves men. Recall to mind, O you transgressors. Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I'm God, and there's none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure." And then verse 11 is where I was really aiming at. He says, "Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man who executes my counsel from a far country. Indeed, I've spoken it. I also will bring it to pass. I have purposed it. I will also do it." Now, by the way, don't think when he says the man who executes my counsel from a far country, that doesn't mean the man who's righteous and such. Like there was a time when God wanted to crush Judah for its sins, and who did he call? Nebuchadnezzar. And he says, my counsel. It wasn't like he was advising, but rather he had something to determine, and so he called forth Nebuchadnezzar. He had something to do with Israel. He called forth the Assyrians. He's talking about he's the one who fundamentally is moving the pieces on the board that are going to decimate the other opponent. So all of our strategies are one thing, but God is the one who's ultimately playing the game, and we're here to experience it in a sense.
Right, which is, I think, actually is a good framework for us to observe the long arc of prophecy. What we know is how it ends.
Right.
We know the punishment that's going to fall upon Jacob and the tribes. We know the punishment, and then kind of like a cycle of how Babylon is punished. Well, let's see what before Babylon is the group for the king of the south. I don't know how we collectively refer to that. It's like
the kind of Arab apparently confederacy. Right.
So no matter how part of what I take this here, and using your other analogy, is no matter how the chessboard looks now,
right,
the moves are set, and it's going to always end the way God wanted it to.
Exactly, and that's what he's accomplishing. He says in Daniel 4 and verse 17, and actually this is in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. I often think this is Daniel who's verbalizing this, but it's actually in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, where he is told this decision, which is one where Nebuchadnezzar goes kind of crazy and becomes like an animal. But he says in the vision, "This decision is by the decree of the watchers, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men." That is, it's easy to think, oh boy, Mr. Trump really knows what he's doing, or boy, look at Netanyahu, man, he's the leader of the century, or boy, the Ayatollah. They, I guess, really know how to make new Ayatollahs. I mean, they're going through them like they're auditioning for some part in a soap opera. But regardless, in the end, all of them will learn, whether it's because they're alive in this life or they get to come up in another resurrection to have it explained to them, that it's really the Most High who rules in the kingdom of men, and he is the one who's actually determining these things for his larger purposes. So that was the first point. The second one is trying to understand how God sees the world, because we tend to think of it as, there's America and there's Russia, or is the Soviet Union before that, or, but God does see the world a little bit differently than us. And nations are a convenient shortcut, right? But fundamentally, it's a little tweaked. God sees the world primarily through families and faiths, not necessarily national borders. It's not that national borders mean nothing. They do mean something. But he does have this biblical focus on families and actual faiths, groups of people with a certain religion. And we don't tend to think of it that way, and the news generally does not think of it that way, but that does seem to be the way that God thinks about it.
Right. I think that's, so the church has long taught the master key to understanding prophecy, which was the identity of nations. And we tend to focus on the identity of the Israelite nations more. But really the key thing is it helps us understand, because the prophecies don't say, and so then America's going to fall, and then the Germans are going to launch a bunch of nukes. You need to know who they were historically, and they are by family groups. This is my more recent study in Genesis. It even takes Jacob's brother Esau and has his main sons and then the grandsons, and so you might think, okay, that's just ancient, family history. Well, those became bigger and bigger groups, just like Israel became bigger and bigger groups. And then over time, we didn't identify them by their family name anymore. We started identifying them by the names of their nations. And the sons of Esau are the same. And sometimes they're mixed. And sometimes you're mixed in with in Iran. We think it's quite possible because over 60% of Iranians are Persian. But there's another group that is not Persian, and we've theorized that the leaders of Iran right now might not be Persian.
Mr. Robinson is the king of giving preview of future points, so that's exactly what we're getting to. He gets so excited. It's a very good. No,
I did see that in the notes, but in my attempt to explain it, we're talking about Iran.
No, it's very good. That was. It's funny he said, because in terms of organizing these notes, a lot of these would have been subpoints under this one point, but that's when I said, we'll go ahead and break them out. But it's good to keep that in mind as an overall picture. Even Russia and Ukraine. Yep. It's easy to think of that as just two nations, but there's a mix of peoples. There's some of the people that are more naturally Russian in the Ukraine. Yeah. There's the Medes. The fact the Medes are involved, you can't take those things for granted. Even millennially. When God talks about Egypt, how Egypt may not, come up at first for the Feast of Tabernacles, he says specifically, the family of Egypt, because that tends to be how God tends to think of peoples. Go back to Genesis chapter, 10? It's the table of nations. There's a descendant of families, and that is how God views much of the world, as well as the different religions. And so before we move on to the point that Mr. Robinson has set up so well, to keep in mind that there's a lot of good cause to expect some eggs to be cracked, if you will, before the end time coming together. Because history has mingled a lot of peoples. Iran is an excellent example that we're about to get to, where in the modern day we tend to think of, nations are who's on charge and how they set the borders and whether they let people out of their country or not. But in the end, it actually there's some reconfiguring of the world that may go on as God is putting His pieces together. So let's jump right to Iran, which is point 3. And man, it's so easy for people to miss this. People tend to lump Iran in with, say, the Arabs. Oh, the Arabs, and they think of Iran, but Iran is not an Arab country. As Mr. Robinson highlighted, it's like, say, 59, 60+% Persian. In fact, I was going through old church materials, the Living Church of God, and there's an article, I think it's early 70s. It could be late 60s, but I'm pretty sure it's early 70s. In which the Shah of Iran, this is before the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the Shah of Iran in the country in Iran, they were celebrating, we're so excited this year in America to be celebrating the 250th anniversary of America. And hey, that's a long time. It's a quarter of a millennium. We're impressed in America because we're not like Europe, where you've had things last longer, even though there's been, some of them have not lasted. They've just been destroyed and reshaped. But when the Shah was doing this at the beginning of the 70s, they were celebrating the 2,000th 1500th anniversary of the beginning of the Persian Empire was Cyrus. That's a 2.5 millennium stretch, and they were the Persian people, and they saw themselves as that.
That's a pretty good run.
Yeah, that's
a
pretty good run.
Share anecdotally, I was telling Mr. Smith about this. I in my previous life, before I started working for the church, I was working at a print company that had a woman, I won't say her name, who was from Iran. And there was a couple things I learned from her pretty quick. She would bristle at being referred to as an Arab. And she explained to me in great detail how she was Persian. And that most of, she just meant the majority was,
yes,
of Iran. Oh, she also told me it's not Iran. She made me start saying Iran and Iranians. Okay. In fact, she was her family was part of the group that fled from Iran with the Shah. Her family was tied in with them, but that she was Persian, and Persian is not Arab. And that was something I never forgot, because I was like, that to Americans, it's like no distinction practically.
Right.
But to them, it was a very, very important distinction.
Oh yeah. I've even read a post on Twitter from a Persian woman in Iran who was complaining. It's like, our leaders are a bunch of Arabs, which they are not technically, as we're actually going to get to. The leaders are far more associated with the Edomites and such. But that said, to kind of wrap this half of this about Iran up, one of the mistakes that it's easy to think is they just lump all the Islamic world together, and consequently, people, for instance, have lumped Iran sometimes thinking, well, that might be because they're the ones causing so much trouble in the region. Maybe they'll lead the king of the South. And I'm not saying there won't be some Mahdi show up who does kind of unite a lot of the Islamic world, though you could see one half of the Islamic world not agreeing, with that being perhaps the guy. But that said, when you look biblically at peoples and other circumstances, there's so many reasons to not conclude that. Not only the fact that Iran really is mostly Persian. And when you look at the people, we'll get to the leadership in just a minute. But even you look at its location, where is it located? Is it south of Jerusalem? Absolutely not. Is it far to the east of Jerusalem? Yes, it is. In fact, on the other side of the Euphrates. Revelation highlights the Euphrates as a key divider between, say, the combatants further to the west versus the kings of the east. So there's so many different reasons. Now, even when we say Iran is Islamic, you might think, well, okay, it's not Arabic, but it is Islamic. Is it really? Yes. If you look, yes, in a technical way, if you look at official statistics, they'd say, 99% of our population is Islamic. But that's because you have hardcore Islamic rulers who, at the point of a gun, which they have demonstrated, they don't mind killing 30,000 of their own people, they will say, well, yes, you are. In fact, if you're in a marriage and the father is Islamic, then your children automatically are. It doesn't make a difference, what the other religion is, the wife. And it's illegal to convert away from it. You create circumstances like that, then, you're going to come across, quote unquote, as Islamic. But a lot of individual surveys carefully done amongst the people suggest otherwise, suggest that no, there are a lot of people there that do not consider themselves Islamic, and I would not be surprised if a lot of those are Persian. Now, that's the people, like Mr. Robinson was saying, the leadership of Iran, and we have an article on this, but it doesn't seem so much Persian, but seems to have ties to Edom and particularly the Amalekites, the Amalekite people. Mr. Hernandez just goes through this so thoroughly in the 2024 January-February issue of the Tomorrow's World magazine in an article titled The True Cause of Trouble in the Middle East. And it's important to recognize that even highlights, again, the not Arab. Who are the Arabs? They are the Ishmaelites. They're descendants of Ishmael. Edom is completely different. Edom, they're the descendants of Esau, actually a brother of Jacob.
The scriptures are quite plain. I mean, it says literally, Edom is Esau.
Yes, and in Exodus 17, Mr. Hernandez just brought this verse up at lunch the other day. Exodus chapter 17 and verse 16. Again, looking at biblical and prophetic elements that do relate to the news we see going on. In Exodus 17, verse 16, It says, for he said, well, get verse 15 for some context. It says, Moses built an altar and called its name, the Eternal is my banner. For he said, because the Eternal has sworn, the Eternal will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. There is a hostility between, say, the sons of Israel and the Amalekites that doesn't even exist between the sons of Israel and the sons of Ishmael. It's a completely different kind of dynamic. Even I was talking with my son Dave in the car, and I don't know if he was surprised or not. We were talking about it and saying that, yeah, we've long known. I remember Condoleezza Rice in the Bush administration highlighting how Iran is more hated by the Arab world than even the U.S. and Israel is. They just, because there's so much division there. So yeah, understand that maybe who's leading Iran, but it's not really the people of Iran. There really are differences there, and that has to be kept in mind. So the next people, and this is kind of a weird one perhaps, because you might think, and the other people involved are America and Israel. Well, we'll get to them. But again, we're trying to think biblically and looking at the overall arc of prophecy, looking at what God is accomplishing in the world. You cannot avoid, or you should not avoid, looking at Europe. The fourth point is, what is going on with Europe when it comes to the war in Iran? And at least my take, I was going to get this email up. We have this great email from Dr. Scott Winnail about this speech that the leader of, in fact, I think I printed it off and forgot to bring it, but I can pull it up.
Prime Minister Starmer?
No, that's for the UK. And actually, they are kind of on the sidelines. Oh, boy, that's a whole other dynamic I didn't even think to mention today. But when it comes to Europe in general, say the EU and Germany, I could be wrong. This is me speculating a bit, but it does seem to be getting under their skins that once again there is major action in the world that they're even in closer proximity to, and they're virtually on the sidelines watching the U.S. just do whatever it wants in a time when they're talking about, we got to ramp up our arms, we got to do more, and yet once again they got nothing.
Yeah, it does feel a little like, how about this? Europe's at least not explicitly against it, which is kind of interesting.
It took a while for some to come around.
They do appear to be sitting on the sidelines, and maybe it's one of these things where they're just kind of waiting to see how things work out. Yeah, it does. Look, the one thing we can also say, with the Strait of Hormuz closed, or at least extremely difficult to move through, that affects the entire world and the world economy, because it's what is it, like 20% of the oil gets out through there, something like that.
Oh, absolutely. It really has been a choke point for the world's oil that has honestly given Iran
some leverage.
Trump card, not Trump card, not trying to be a play on words, but really leverage that has honestly kept the regime probably in place for as long as it has. Dr. Scott Winnail over there in the UK sent us a really great, well, I say great, informative speech by President von der Leyen of the EU. She gave this speech, and let's see, he said this really just yesterday, I think. She gave it, looks like March 8th, perhaps, at least in this reporting from cc.europa.eu. And I won't go into it, but she's talking to different ambassadors, et cetera. And I'll just hit some quotes because he does a great job of finding just key notes. She says, for instance, that Europe must focus on the reality of the situation concerning the war in Iran, to see the world as it actually is today. I want to be clear. There should be no tears shed for the Iranian regime that has inflicted death and imposed repression on its own people. She goes on and talks about them slaughtering 17,000, for instance, of their own people. And she talks about what their focus needs to be. How she says we need to build our own European path and find new ways of cooperating with partners. The second, her point, she says, is that we need a clear-eyed and hard look at our foreign policy, that is Europe's, in today's world, both in how it is designed and how it is deployed. She says later, the goal is to make ourselves more resilient, more sovereign, and more powerful, from defense to energy, from critical raw materials to strategic technologies. She goes on to talk about these kinds of things. Later on, she says, my first point is security and defense. Later she says, in fact, security must become the organizing principle of our action. That is, the military security of Europe has to be the thing that's organizing everything else. She says, peace and security in Europe depends on us, and we're taking full responsibility for it. There's a lot more that could be said. I don't want to read all of this, but it's interesting because while Europe seems, I mean, it's not, it is contributing bases here and there. You know, it's doing things, but what we are looking at is how to think about these things biblically. And in biblically, that's what you do is you look at the people that you know are a big part of the end game in the Bible, and then you say, how is this impacting them?
Right.
Because that's not what you're going to see in the headlines, but that's what the Bible points you to. And at the very least, this is just continuing to provoke Europe about how they are, in a sense, almost impotent in the world in which they seek to be the leader. Yep. And I imagine Chancellor Merz, I think he's a defense foreign minister, Boris Pistorius, one of my favorite names in the EU, how they've just got to be chomping at the bit to think this is something we should have a bigger say in, and we're like whispering in a noisy stadium. So continue to watch Europe. There's another point.
And, you know, say what you want to be about being allies and all this strategic interest. If America stumbled and couldn't be what it used to be on the world scene, Europe would happily fill that
new,
you know,
the void, the
vacuum.
vacuum. Yeah. Well, I've thought, because they are ramping up their defense weaponry factories, and, you know, German engineering has quite the reputation of being very good. I've wondered if some of the technologies that are causing such challenges, if their ability to watch on the sidelines, right, and learn from what's going on, and even be suppliers to a certain extent of allies, you know, what might they invent that could be a game changer, you know, in some kind of ways. Mr. Robinson was talking about what he's read concerning how, you know, Iran clearly has tried to work to adopt strategies to counter. They've been planning for this forever, you know, and to counter what they thought the American Navy would do in an attack. And then, of course, the U.S., like, I love the phrase you said that Jocko always says, was it the enemy always gets to say?
Yeah.
And then the U.S., knowing that they know this, then change their own strategy. Yep. So it's one thing. I've heard people play armchair quarterback like, man, I don't understand why they bombed this. That doesn't make any sense. So you don't understand. There's military. This is their whole life, is planning events like this, and they have probably thought 7 ways down the chain that you haven't even thought about. So, and that I surely that's what's going on in Europe right now, is they're trying to learn from these events, and it's kind of like this odd reference. Honestly, it's like Batman in the Justice League. Batman has all these allies: Superman, the Flash, Wonder Woman. By the way, I'm not endorsing all of this. I used to be a Marvel guy. I wasn't a big fan of DC Comics. However, one of the things I always thought was fun about that lore was, even though they were his allies, Batman had always devised ways to defeat even his friends. He knew he had a plan for defeating Superman. He had a plan for defeating Wonder Woman. He had a plan for defeating the Flash. And those are contingency plans he always had ready to go. I always thought it was fascinating. That's part of the Batman mystique. And honestly, if Europe isn't also among the reasons why he's Batman. And among those things, I can't imagine Europe's not doing the same. Yeah. Not just that, well, we can't rely on the U.S., but what if we had to go against the U.S.? And of course, prophetically, we know they will.
Yeah, right, exactly. Okay, here's our fifth and final point. And listen, there are still major things that could come out of this Iran war that affects the Middle East, or you know, things we just don't even know. But my sense of it, my intuition is that in some ways this actually has the most effect on America. In some ways, what's going on now is the most significant for the U.S. And my reasons are a little bit nebulous, but that's kind of my feel. I do have one biblical example in here when we get to it.
I see it coming. That was good. Okay. So when you look at, because we're talking about all the different parties involved and trying to think about them biblically, there's America and Israel. But again, who are America and Israel? And not necessarily just the national boundaries, but because at this point, even Israel is a pretty cosmopolitan city. I mean, you can see a lot of different people there. But when you trace the descendants of Manasseh, one of the tribes of and not just trace them, but if you actually, the main evidence, we've talked about this in a whole nother podcast, if you look at the prophetic significance, clearly America came to be home for a lot of that tribe of Manasseh, because a lot of the promises given to the sons of Joseph were given to America and the UK and others. And then you look at the descendants of Judah. Clearly, while there's descendants of Judah all over the world, clearly Israel, the modern nation of Israel and its borders houses many of them as a key Jewish nation. Well, in all of this, they have a wake-up call coming. It may not happen right now, but right now we do know is surely going to be used by God to figure into that wake-up call. So I thought it'd be interesting to look at some different possibilities in that regard. For instance, one could be that we end up having to accept a pretend victory. Mm-hmm. That pretend victory could be where the Iranian regime is severely weakened, but it isn't removed. They just kind of agree, okay, you know what, we'll do all this, just leave us alone. Well, that would be incredibly disappointing to the people who've been persecuted by that regime, because it's not like that necessarily is going to go away in the end. But also, it would be fairly humiliating for the U.S., and it would embolden its enemies. China in particular, a lot of observers have noticed that China is watching this, and that China, to a great degree, is very possibly the U.S.'s real target in this, because they were not just saying, oh, no, Iran's a problem, but seeing how China was using Iran to potentially get its own chokehold on the Strait of Hormuz, influence there. In February, even had made a deal to give Iran some of these supersonic weapons against our battleships and such, that it really would embolden the enemies of the United States for us to take such serious action and to settle for a quasi-win. That's important to keep in mind.
Right. You just made me think of something. The U.S. could strategically win this war, but if Iran managed somehow to sink one of the 3 aircraft carriers over there, that would be a pretty big ding on U.S. military strength, and think, they're not unstoppable.
Oh yeah, even if it was only a symbolic victory, if say an aircraft carrier or something like that were to go down, it would. It's kind of funny, when you're the big guy, you could win, and you're just used to win. Everyone's used to you winning the game, winning the game all the time. You know what? If you lose just one game, it's not like you're not the big guy. You're still defeating almost. That's what's important. Everybody you want to, but everyone remembers that one game you lost, and now there's a chink in your armor, and you feel like the whole world is full of new possibilities.
Which is why America reminds me of Samson.
Now here he's going to go.
Here we
All
go.
Right.
Okay, I've mentioned this before, but I've never gone into great detail, and even here we don't have a lot of time for that. But if you go back and read the 4 chapters dedicated to Samson and his story, it's very interesting, because the first chapter details his parents being approached by the angel of the Lord, saying you should expect a son, and I'm going to use him for my purposes, and you need to put him under a Nazirite vow. Okay. So then we get to the next chapter, and it switches to him. He's figured out that he's super, super strong. I mean, almost truly like if we're going to stick with the DC universe, I mean, he's kind of Superman. I mean, there's nothing he can't seem to do. His enemies can't stop him, can't kill him. He wins everything he wants to do. But that's the thing. In his own life, he's kind of like this. He has no real purpose in his life. If you read through his whole story, he has no real purpose. He has all this strength, all this freedom, and he's like this archetype of this great, great strength, but like without knowledge, without even restraints on his capabilities.
Right.
And so if you think about the 3 key, this is a vast oversimplification, but when you're put under a Nazirite vow, you're told not to, well, not only just not drink alcohol, but like you're not even supposed to touch the grapes and the vines and things. Strict. You're not supposed to be around dead bodies, carcasses of any type. And, within the second chapter about Samson, he's done 2 of those 3 things. So, the one thing he sticks with is the hair, but he's not sure exactly what his purpose is. But the thing is, God uses him for his purposes, and I might just
even when he doesn't embrace his own purpose, God still uses him.
Exactly. And he does have this kind of loose idea that he's supposed to be doing something for God, but he kind of seems to make it up like what he wants to do is what God must want him to do.
Right.
And so I'd refer you to Judges 14. I would read 3 and 4 so you could get the whole context, but the key thing here is verse 4. because his parents are upset that he keeps chasing after foreign women. In verse 4, but his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines, for at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. Well, obviously the roles are flipped here, but it's so interesting. Like, this war in Iran could actually be God kind of directing America, but he's kind of bringing events to where he wants them to be.
Right.
So,
even if America has kind of different ideas of why it's doing what it's doing, but God is actually using it in some way.
Exactly. So I still struggle. I know that there are some people that have written on it. You shared with me an article earlier today that has some explanations, but I think most people still don't really understand why we've attacked Iran. And even when Mr. President Trump has kind of said the reasons why, I still think, okay, so why are we attacking Iran again? It wasn't a clear and present danger to us, unless perhaps it's this kind of Chinese angle. That would make a lot of sense.
Right, behind the scenes, possibly. Right.
And so then I might, so the purposes of what America's doing, whatever we think we're doing, God could very easily be using that to bring about another major step in prophecy. But I also might refer to Mr. O'Gwen's one of his commentaries about this section of Judges, and he says one of the lessons that we need to learn is that God can sometimes use people in spite of themselves. God sometimes uses carnal individuals to accomplish his work. They do it for the wrong reasons and motives, but God has a result that he wants to come out. God was going to deliver Israel. He utilized Samson and worked to teach Samson a lesson in the meantime. Samson ultimately learned that lesson. Samson trusted his strength,
right,
which is a big thing with America right now. Like, we are big and powerful. We have a huge economy. We have a huge military. The reason we have a huge military is because we can afford. Part of it is.
Right.
And in fact, that's one of Iran's strategies, is to throw cheap, $30,000 drones at it, and then we have to use a $5 million missile to shoot it down.
Right.
But the missile costs vary,
right,
but they're way more than what Iran is spending on theirs. And so to kind of conclude my idea, because I would say, you correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Smith, or let me know how you feel about this. I mean, there's a lot of still kind of quasi-Christians in America, or evangelicals, that believe that we are serving God in some way, and we're supposed to support Israel. And so then what we're doing now is kind of something that God would want us to do. And most Americans, I would say, especially if you just look at us by our behavior, how are we going about our lives right now? We can't imagine a world in which the United States is not the great superpower.
I was just thinking of that earlier today in preparation for this. For generations, it is impossible to imagine a world in which America can't do essentially what it seems to want to do. We don't even identify with. We don't know what it's like to be in a country that can't just exert its will in the world. Yeah.
So when you just to complete the arc on Samson's life, when God brings the story to conclusions, the 4th chapter, it starts off with, Here Samson once again is going in and finding a harlot. So he's certainly not living the kind of life that God would have in mind.
Right.
But this kind of leads to the final conclusion. And, he finally breaks that third and final vow, which God, I think this is fair. When you read the whole story and he breaks one vow and then a second vow, and God still backs him, so to speak, he maintains his great strength. But once that third and final vow was broken like that, that was it. And his strength was gone. And it was suddenly, which I think is also interesting. And so his enemies come, put their hands on him, put him in fetters, put him in prison, put his eyes out. And it was, I just think there's too much correlation to where in the time of Jacob's trouble, when our great might is broken and we're humbled on the world scene, and a lot of people go into captivity. This is kind of what Samson experienced. And it was only in the captivity that he was like, maybe there's a lesson in here for me, and then the conclusion of a story does show. Well, I think it's an important point that's getting a little bit away from our podcast today, but like a key thing that God is going to do for all nations in the end time, when people like the Philistines would briefly beat, in this case, the God's hero for Israel, or Israel as a nation, the nations tended to conclude one of two things. They concluded either that God was not powerful enough to save his people, or God had abandoned his people. It was always one of those two conclusions.
You're right, yeah.
And so the defeat of the Philistines at the temple to, it wasn't Dagon, wasn't it? But one of their big pagan temples, and Samson bringing the pillars down and collapsing and killing everybody was primarily to show that Samson was not defeated for either one of those reasons. And in the end time, when God shows that he preserves Israel and all its descendants through, because I think the way that this is going to go makes it think that we're going to run out of Israelites on the earth unless God intervened. And they would cease to be a nation.
Right.
And there will be, once again, God will show all the earth who Israel was, and then he preserved them all down through this time. And I'm still their God.
I love all of that so much. Like in particular, it's easy, at the NRB, I might have mentioned this last time when I was back, but the National Religious Broadcasters Convention, one of the final speakers they had before we left was the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth. And, that's one of the neat things about the NRB is Mr. Trump came to one not too long ago, and then I think Vice President what's his name? No, not Vance. The one before in the first Trump administration. He came, and anyway, Mike Pence. But regardless, it was exciting seeing Mr. Pete Hegseth talk, and he was passionate and excited. Loves his country, was passionate about it, and passionate about the military. He talked about how we're going to make them. I can't remember what it was. We're not going to trans the military. We're going to train the military. I mean, he had all these real talking points. You could tell let's say this, he's no stranger to the lectern. And you see a lot of pride there. And it's easy to think, oh, this is a righteous country and we're going to be on a righteous, but it's been easy to judge Samson is like, oh, look, he's clearly a righteous man. Look how God is blessing. But then when you really look at it, like you said, no, he was actually violating, code after code. And just because God hasn't allowed him to fall yet doesn't mean he's on the right trajectory.
Right,
Don't think just because God keeps blessing what he's doing. Rather, God is allowing these things to happen because he's got a goal in mind. But it's in those cases, it was despite Samson's actions, despite this side, he's just drinking it up, and he's running around with women and doing these things. But then there does come a time when the final straw, lands, and that's it. And so, yeah, it's very easy to imagine, oh, yeah, God is just really, he's giving us victory after victory because we're great.
Right.
No, he might be giving us victory after victory despite our actions because he has a larger purpose. And all these victories are really just more time to repent and get our act together. What if before he got his hair cut, Samson had a wake-up call and thought, man, what am I doing?
Yeah.
I can't believe how God has let me booze and
this
all
woman doesn't even like me. She sold me out like 3 times.
That's right. He had an opportunity to figure it out. So, I love that. So this could be that kind of thing where we settle because deep down we just want peace for ourselves. We want to kind of possibly cut off China. Maybe we achieve those ends and we just let kind of a little regime in place, but that would look like America failing to completely exert itself. And so that's one of the possibilities.
Plus it's as also was prophesied, prophesy to us smooth things,
Yeah,
we hear this land, we don't want to hear about trouble in the world. We don't want to hear America still doing what America's doing, and everything is going to be okay,
right?
And our life is not going to change,
right? Another possibility is because this is something that truly is impacting the entire world, increasingly so. It could be that Iran, because they understand this is kind of do or die for them. The regime it's either going to last or it's not. And so in a situation like that, you do some desperate things. And especially with what they're doing in the Straits of Hormuz, man, it makes great news footage to see these giant burning oil tankers. It's dramatic. Every station in the world is going to cover it. And it could be that they just make it painful enough for the entire world that even if we do win, everyone else has suffered so much, the U.S. is seen as, okay, maybe they're powerful, but we're sure tired of that, just because they don't mind, because they've got enough resources to survive something like this. The rest of us are suffering with the price of oil skyrocketing and other instability, our products we can't sell. And so there's that kind of possibility. If you don't see Pax Americana, the American peace, really benefiting you anymore, you're not so interested in supporting the country that's making it happen.
Because the world does pay a price and a tax for being under Pax Americana.
Oh, they really do. We kind of talk about that a little bit in the old article on that we have in the Tomorrow's World magazine. But after all, people don't mind because, hey, America on top is kind of making life pretty decent for the rest of us. We're all making some money, Yeah, some people are suffering, but, it's not me. But once everybody starts suffering, you start thinking about it differently. But then, hey, let's be open to it. Samson hasn't had his hair cut yet. He's done all these other things. Maybe the U.S. and Israel just come out, man, on as top can be. They win. The regime is gone. Next thing you know, there's photos of Mr. Pete Hegseth just taking a tour through the rubble. You got Mr. Trump shaking hands with the new Shah, and it's a new Persian empire, whatever the case is. Mr. Robinson's point about Samson is still the case. That would not change the overall outcome that God is working towards. And that's why even if you were to see it, you think, oh, well, I guess prophecy's wrong. No, God is never wrong. The great wake-up call that is the great tribulation still is coming. Yeah. In a case like that, I would instead turn to Leviticus 26 and verse 19, which highlights one of the kinds of ways God's punished whenever a people have great pride in their power. It would still be true that God says here, I will break the pride of your power. I will make your heavens like iron and your earth like bronze. And we are a proud people. And just because if we were to have a great victory like that, and don't get me wrong, I would love to see the Iranian people not being murdered by their own government. I mean, just like von der Leyen said, no, let's not cry over some horrific regime that falls. If anything, that would be something wonderful. But don't take your eye off of the ark of prophecy. Let me ask you, what do you think that's going to do for how much redder is American blood going to run? If we happen to win this, do you think it's like, this is fantastic, let's all embrace the Sabbath and the holy days? Or is it be like, yeah, America, we can really kind of do anything.
Let's export more perversion from Hollywood.
That's right. Just like Mr. Weston said not too long ago, Proverbs 16, verse 18, pride comes before a fall. And so it would not be shocking for America to see a peak in its pride to make the fall that much more painful.
Guess what, Mr. Smith?
What Mr. Robinson?
That's what happened in the Samson
arc. Oh, look at that.
So the final chapter that concludes his arc.
Yeah.
He comes in and goes after this harlot. They all know that he's there. He kind of dodges them, and then when he decides to leave, he goes and picks up the gates of the city.
Oh, yeah.
And runs off with them. So let me tell you.
Can you just imagine that? Some man grabbing the gates of a city. That's just fascinating.
I've got some data on it.
Do you really? Oh, go.
Okay.
Look at you.
So people, it seems like you can actually get a pretty good read on this because we know so much archaeological about how things were built and what materials they were used. So it's estimated that the gates of the city that he was in was between 10 and 21,000 pounds, so 5 to 10 tons, depending on the thickness of the door. So
wow.
Imagine a man walks out into a parking lot, picks up a GMC Yukon extra large, curb weight is about 6,000 pounds, picks up one in each hand and ran off with it. Okay? That would be pretty amazing.
It would be.
But he goes to where he deposits them. We can calculate that pretty accurately. 35 to 40 miles away with 3,200 feet in elevation gain. So he doesn't just pick up two cars. He runs 35 miles going up 3,500 feet and just leaves them there, which would be. So it's crazy. Like, and I don't know about if it's what's his greatest thing he ever accomplished, but that was pretty impressive. And he's thinking he's the man, and then he runs into Delilah, and it all wraps up pretty quickly.
Wow. That is astonishing. So, man, that does fit, Mr. Robinson. Look at you doing this. That even if it was like a super victory, how do you know God isn't just allowing the pride to maximize itself before the fall comes? So don't let things like that somehow dissuade you from the ark of prophecy.
If you think about it from his perspective, why would he think anything other than God is always and even then,
Samson?
Yeah, Samson. Yeah. Why would he assume anything changed? Nothing. He does whatever he wants, and nothing's changed. And he has this great strength. And then you also start to lose sight of where the source of the strength comes from. So if you look at America, I would argue that goes all the way back to the promises made to Abraham by God.
Yes.
And I do think that the people kind of have to do their part. So, right. But in essence, the great strength here in this end time comes from something very, very different. And same thing with Samson. His great strength was not because he was working out. It wasn't.
It was God. And I really like how your story brings that out, because it's not like he knew that, he acted on it, and then at the end he failed to know that, and that's when he failed. No, he forgot that from the beginning. And Mr. Robinson, bring in the Samson facts. I love how
the Samson story. It started with, what's with the Samson story? So I thought I should research it and try to figure out what it was.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and wrap this up and say that we hope all this isn't disappointing. That we're not sitting here predicting the outcome of this specific instance according to the Bible. But the fact is, the Bible just does not literally predict the outcome of every skirmish, every conflict, or even every war. This U.S. Israeli-led war could go in a lot of different directions. But the bigger picture, the arc of history, is determined. And choosing to think biblically about current events like these doesn't mean trying to predict the outcome, nor does it mean trying to invest religious significance in all the different media narratives, whether it's CNN's or Fox News or Newsmax's. Here's what it means: being mindful of God's prophetic endgame, being mindful of all the biblical factors at play that the news analysts ignore, and praying fundamentally not for any preferred outcome, no matter how emotional we feel about it, but fundamentally praying for God's will to be accomplished and for his kingdom to come quickly.